Everyone. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something called Project 2025.
Right.
Our listener has sent in some research and notes on it,
Yeah.
and they're really concerned about what this policy roadmap could mean for democracy and freedom here in the U.S.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that.
Okay. So this document really lays out, I guess you could call it a plan to kind of fundamentally reshape the American government.
Yeah.
It's trying to replace what you might consider the foundational values of the United States with a very specific and I would argue narrow ideology.
I see. It looks like one of the things that they're promoting is expanding something called religious liberty exemptions.
Right.
What would that mean, and how could that actually negatively affect different parts of life here in America?
Yeah, so essentially these exemptions could allow people to discriminate against others in really important areas like, healthcare,
Right.
education, adoption, even employment. They argue that these exemptions are necessary to protect their religious freedom, but in practice, they could be used to justify all sorts of discrimination and intolerance.
And that would kind of roll back decades of progress.
Exactly. It's like we're going backwards. Imagine adoption agencies refusing to place children with same-sex couples just because of their religious beliefs.
I see what you're saying.
Or healthcare providers denying treatment to people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Or employers firing people because they're not the right religion.
That sounds pretty scary. One of the other things that I noticed in here that they're really trying to focus on is redefining marriage and family.
Yeah.
And they're saying that the only correct definition of marriage is, a heterosexual couple with biologically related children.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the consequences of that?
Well, this definition really permeates the entire document. It's not just about marriage. They're basically trying to redefine the purpose of the American government itself. They want to limit access to social services like welfare or food stamps to families that fit this very narrow definition. They want to roll back legal protections for LGBTQ plus people and their families. And they even talk about rewriting public school curriculums to exclude any mention of diverse family structures.
Right. Wow. That's pretty intense.
It really is. And it's just one example of how they're trying to impose their worldview on everyone else.
One of the things that really kind of jumped out at me that seemed particularly alarming was their support for reviving this thing called the Comstock Act. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Oh, yeah, I know about the Comstock Act. It's a pretty archaic law from the 1870s.
Yeah.
And it basically banned the mailing of anything considered immoral, which at the time included things like contraceptive devices and even information about contraception.
Right.
So bringing back a law like that in this day and age, especially after Roe v. Wade has been overturned, would have absolutely devastating consequences for reproductive rights and women's health.
Definitely. I noticed that they're proposing renaming the Department of Health and Human Services to the Department of Life.
Right.
Which, I don't know, it just feels like a shift in priorities to me at least.
Oh, it definitely is. They're not even trying to hide it. That name change alone would signal a massive shift in how the government approaches healthcare. I mean, we could see a situation where the Department of Life would have control over billions of dollars in funding, and they could use that money to prioritize anti-abortion organizations and services that adhere to this very strict religious view of family.
I see. So there's a direct call to dismantle the Department of Education.
Yeah.
I guess that would mean eliminating all federal support for public schools.
Mm-hmm.
What could be the impact of that?
Mm-hmm. So that goes hand in hand with their push for school vouchers. They want to redirect taxpayer dollars away from public schools and towards private schools, a lot of which are religiously affiliated. And they even talk about removing accreditation requirements for these private schools, which would mean that the quality of education could plummet, while at the same time, public money is being funneled into institutions that promote a very specific religious agenda.
Right. It seems like there's also a very strong sense of dismissing climate change as a serious concern. Mm-hmm. And a rationale seems to be that God wouldn't allow the earth to be destroyed.
Right. And that's just, one example of how they're letting their religious beliefs dictate policy over, actual scientific evidence.
So that could have huge consequences.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about potentially drastic cuts to environmental regulations, maybe even dismantling the EPA altogether.
Wow.
They could start suppressing scientific information about climate change, making it harder for scientists to do their work and for the public to understand the risks. And of course, all of this would mean that we're not taking the necessary steps to mitigate the effects of climate change, which puts the environment and public health at risk.
So something else that I was reading in here is that they have a plan to essentially replace career government officials with individuals who really strongly align with the ideology of this project.
Yes. And they're very open about this. In fact, there have been leaked training videos where they explicitly talk about how to identify and remove people within government agencies who might be opposed to their agenda.
Wow.
And the goal here is really to eliminate any opposition from within the government so that they can implement this plan as quickly and efficiently as possible.
This is pretty incredible. There's this really specific proposal to amend labor laws to mandate overtime pay for anyone who works on Sunday.
Right.
And specifically, it seems to be targeting Sunday, which is the Christian Sabbath.
Yes. And the only exception they make is for employers who observe a different religious Sabbath. So it's very clearly based on a religious justification.
I see.
There's really no secular rationale for this. It's just another example of how they're trying to impose the tenets of a specific religion onto the entire workforce, regardless of people's individual beliefs.
It's very interesting that they're so focused on one particular religion. And it just feels like, this whole agenda, this whole plan is just really in conflict with basic democratic principles.
Oh, absolutely. It is. I mean, for one thing, it relies on a very narrow and exclusionary interpretation of American values. They're basically saying that their specific religious viewpoint is the only legitimate one and everyone else needs to conform to it. And that's just not how a democracy works. A democracy is supposed to be about respecting the diversity of beliefs and values that exist within society. And then, of course, there's the fact that they're trying to bypass the legislative process altogether. They're not interested in building consensus or engaging in debate. They're just focused on using executive action and administrative changes to implement their agenda as quickly as possible.
And a lot of these policies that they're talking about seem to be deeply unpopular with, the majority of Americans.
Exactly. So it's not just that they're undemocratic in their methods. The substance of what they're proposing is also deeply at odds with what most Americans believe. And that's really, kind of the scary part, right? They're trying to dismantle the very systems that are in place to prevent any one person or group from having too much power.
Right. So you're saying they want to weaken those institutions that were designed specifically to make sure that no one part of the government becomes too powerful.
Exactly. So, for example, they talk about limiting the power of congressional committees, which would make it much harder for Congress to investigate the executive branch and hold them accountable. They also want to pack the courts with judges who align with their ideology, which would basically give them control over the judiciary as well.
It's really interesting that they're focusing so much on the judiciary branch.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're not stupid. They understand that the courts have an enormous amount of power to shape American society, and they want to make sure that the courts are upholding their worldview.
Yeah.
And they've already made a lot of progress on this front. The current Supreme Court already has a very strong conservative lean, and many of the justices are very sympathetic to the goals of Project 2025.
Oh, wow.
So they're working very hard to maintain that trend, and if they succeed, it could have a profound impact on American law and society for generations to come.
Wow, that's scary to think about.
It really is, because, ultimately the balance of power is essential to the functioning of a democracy.
Right.
And Project 2025 is really all about disrupting that balance and concentrating power in the hands of a select few.
This almost sounds like tactics that are used by, more authoritarian regimes.
It's very similar, yeah. And, I think it's important to remember that these people are very serious about achieving their goals, and they're willing to use any means necessary to do so.
Wow. So what can we do to kind of push back against this?
Well, I think the first step is just to be aware of what they're doing, to understand their tactics and their goals.
Right.
And then we need to start defending the institutions that protect our democracy, speaking out against their attacks on the courts, on Congress, on the free press.
Yeah.
Of course, we need to hold our elected officials accountable, making sure that they're not complicit in this agenda.
I see. It seems like another thing that this research is showing is that they're really trying to replace our system of pluralism, which is really the bedrock of American society, with just one singular worldview.
Right. And that's a really dangerous thing because pluralism is essential to a functioning democracy.
Yeah.
It means recognizing and respecting the diversity of beliefs, values, and lifestyles that exist within a society. And it means allowing people to live their lives according to their own conscience without fear of persecution or discrimination.
Right.
And that's exactly what Project 2025 is trying to destroy. They want to impose a single worldview on everyone And that worldview is based on a very narrow and fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity.
So they're basically saying, if you don't agree with us, you're not welcome here.
Exactly. And that's just, that's fundamentally un-American. It goes against everything that this country is supposed to stand for.
Yeah.
And it's a recipe for division, conflict, and ultimately, I think, violence.
They do seem to be using a lot of rhetoric about religious freedom to justify these actions.
No, absolutely. They're constantly talking about how their right to practice their faith is being infringed upon, and they're using that as a justification for trying to impose their beliefs on everyone else.
Right.
But that's a very dangerous and distorted interpretation of religious freedom. I mean, the First Amendment guarantees the free exercise of religion, but it also prohibits the establishment of a state religion. And that's exactly what Project 2025 is trying to do. They're trying to blur that line between church and state, and they're trying to create a system where one religion is privileged above all others.
So what you're saying is that they're trying to create a theocracy.
Exactly. And, I think it's important to be very clear about this. Religious freedom is a fundamental American value.
Right.
And we need to defend it. But we need to defend it for everyone.
Yeah.
We need to reject attempts to use it as a cover for discrimination and intolerance. And we need to make sure that everyone in this country is free to practice their faith or no faith at all without fear of persecution or discrimination.
It's crucial to understand this plan's historical context.
Absolutely. The United States has always had a very complex relationship with religion.
Right.
I mean, on the one hand, the founders of our nation were deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, and they believed very strongly in the separation of church and state. But at the same time, religion has always played a very significant role in American life. And there have been periods in our history when religious fervor has led to intolerance and oppression.
So we've seen this before.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in recent decades, the rise of the religious right has really renewed this push to inject religion into public life, and they've been very successful in some areas.
Right.
I mean, they've played a key role in restricting access to abortion, for example, and in opposing LGBTQ+ rights.
I see.
But Project 2025 really represents the culmination of these efforts.
Wow.
It's the most ambitious attempt yet to establish a Christian theocracy in the United States.
This research is really disturbing. It seems like they're trying to control every aspect of society.
Oh, absolutely. They're not just focused on government. They also want to control education, the media, the arts. They want to create a culture that reflects their worldview.
And that would have a devastating impact on freedom of expression, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it would stifle creativity and innovation. It would create a society that's intolerant and oppressive, They claim that they're just trying to protect traditional values, but their vision of tradition is incredibly narrow and exclusionary, and it ignores the realities of American history and the diversity of American society.
It seems like they're trying to erase anything that doesn't fit into their narrative.
Exactly. And that's just, that's incredibly harmful and dangerous.
So, okay, this is all pretty overwhelming. What can we do? How do we push back against this? How do we fight this? It feels like such a powerful force.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to defend the diversity and dynamism of American culture, right? We need to resist these attempts to impose a single worldview. And we need to celebrate the richness and complexity of our heritage, all the different traditions and beliefs and values that make up this country.
Yeah.
And I think education is a really crucial battleground in this fight.
Oh, absolutely.
Because education is essential to a functioning democracy, right? It helps citizens develop the knowledge and skills they need to participate in civic life.
Right.
It fosters critical thinking and problem-solving abilities. It promotes tolerance and understanding.
But what you're saying is these people don't want that.
Exactly. They don't want people to think critically.
Right.
They don't want people to question their authority. They want to indoctrinate children into their ideology.
Wow.
They want to silence dissenting views.
It seems like they're trying to dismantle public education as we know it.
Exactly. And that's why, we need to defend the integrity of our education system.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that all students have access to a quality education, an education that's free from bias and indoctrination, an education that teaches them about democracy, pluralism, and critical thinking, because those are the skills that they need to resist authoritarianism.
Absolutely. And, the media also plays such a huge role in shaping public opinion. So how can we make sure that, the public is actually getting accurate information?
That's a really, really important question because the media is absolutely crucial to a functioning democracy.
Right.
I mean, it's supposed to inform the public. It's supposed to hold those in power accountable, and it's supposed to provide a platform for diverse voices and perspectives.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the media landscape has become incredibly fragmented and polarized in recent years, and that makes it really, really difficult to have these kinds of informed conversations and debates.
So it's hard to know what to believe anymore.
Exactly. And the rise of social media has only made this problem worse. I mean, these platforms are often used to spread misinformation and disinformation, and they can create these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs.
Right. They just get like trapped in their own little bubbles.
Exactly. And so, I think it's really, really important to be a critical consumer of information, to be aware of the biases of different media outlets, and to make sure that you're getting your information from a variety of sources.
Yeah.
We need to hold our media outlets accountable, demand that they provide accurate and unbiased information. And we need to support journalists who are committed to reporting the truth, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient.
Right.
And I think it's also really important to be mindful of how social media can be used to manipulate and divide us.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to use these platforms responsibly.
Right.
We need to promote dialogue and civic engagement, and we need to be careful not to spread misinformation ourselves.
So, okay, what about civil society? What role does that play in all of this?
Civil society is absolutely vital in this fight.
Can you define that term a little bit? Like, what do you mean by civil society?
Yeah, so civil society basically refers to all of those non-governmental organizations, community groups, advocacy groups, and individuals who are actively engaged in civic life. They're providing essential services, they're advocating for important causes, and they're holding those in power accountable.
But you're saying that the people behind Project 2025 don't like that very much.
Exactly. They view civil society with a lot of suspicion. They see it as a threat to their agenda.
I see.
And they often try to weaken or eliminate organizations that challenge their worldview.
Wow. So they want to silence anyone who disagrees with them.
Exactly. And so, it's really, really important to defend the role of civil society, to support these organizations that are working to protect our rights and freedoms and to encourage civic engagement.
Okay. And this isn't just an American issue, right? I mean, this has implications for the rest of the world as well.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States has a lot of people in the international community very, very concerned.
Why is that? Why should other countries be worried about this?
Well, for one thing, the United States has long been a leader in promoting democracy and human rights around the world, and Project 2025 really threatens to undermine that leadership.
Right.
I mean, it sends a very dangerous message to other countries.
What kind of message?
It suggests that it's okay to discriminate against minorities, that it's okay to erode democratic norms, and that's something that we should all be very, very worried about.
Right.
And so, I think it's really important for the international community to speak out against Project 2025 and the threat that it poses to democracy and human rights.
So they need to take a stand against this.
Exactly. They need to support pro-democracy activists and organizations in the United States, and they need to promote international cooperation and solidarity in defense of democracy.
Right.
Because this is a global fight. It's not just about the United States. It's about the future of democracy everywhere.
And you mentioned earlier that one of the ways that they're trying to justify this is by appealing to morality, by saying that, they have the moral high ground. But what are the ethical implications of this?
Well, they claim that their values are the only true values, and they seek to impose those values on everyone else. But the problem is that their morality is incredibly narrow and exclusionary. And it's based on a very rigid and literal interpretation of Christianity that doesn't leave any room for nuance or complexity.
Okay, so it's not really about morality at all.
Exactly. It's about control. It's about power.
It's about imposing their will on everyone else.
Exactly. And so, I think it's really important to reject this kind of false morality and to defend a morality that's based on compassion, empathy, and respect for all people, regardless of their beliefs or their background.
Yeah, so this research really highlights how this plan specifically targets certain groups, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this agenda poses a very grave threat to LGBTQ plus individuals, to women, to people of color, to religious minorities, anyone who doesn't fit into their very narrow and exclusionary worldview.
And how would it affect these groups specifically?
Well, I mean, for one thing, their emphasis on religious liberty exemptions could be used to justify discrimination in all sorts of areas like housing, healthcare, employment. We could see businesses refusing to serve LGBTQ plus customers, healthcare providers denying care to women who have had abortions, employers firing people because of their race or religion. I mean, the possibilities are really endless.
So they're basically trying to legalize discrimination.
Exactly. And their attack on reproductive rights is equally alarming.
Right.
I mean, by reviving the Comstock Act and empowering the Department of Life, they're essentially trying to restrict access to contraception and abortion care, and that's going to have a devastating impact on women, particularly low-income women and women of color who already face significant barriers to accessing health care.
Wow. And this research also shows that they're going after people of color and religious minorities as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they talk about further eroding voting rights, restricting immigration, limiting access to education and healthcare for these communities. I mean, it's really a blueprint for a society where white Christian privilege is enshrined in law and where diversity is seen as a threat rather than a strength.
So what you're describing is a very bleak and frightening vision of America.
It is. It's a vision of America that I don't think any of us want to live in. And that's why it's so important to fight back against this agenda, to stand in solidarity with these communities that are being targeted and to defend the rights and freedoms of all Americans.
So their fight is our fight.
Exactly. And we need to understand that. We can't afford to be complacent.
So what's at stake here? I mean, if this succeeds, what happens to America?
Well, I mean, the stakes are incredibly high.
Right.
This is not just some political game. This is a battle for the soul of America.
Right.
And if Project 2025 is implemented, it will fundamentally transform this country. It will undermine our democracy, it will erode our freedoms, and it will create a society that is intolerant, oppressive, and ultimately, I think, unsustainable.
Right. I mean, this goes against everything that America is supposed to stand for.
Exactly. And that's why we can't let this happen. We have to resist this agenda with everything we've got.
But one thing that they really seem to be leaning on is this idea of American exceptionalism.
Oh, yeah. They love to talk about American exceptionalism.
Right.
They believe that the United States has this unique role to play in the world, that we're this shining city on a hill, this beacon of freedom and democracy, and that we have this moral obligation to spread our values and our influence around the globe.
But their version of America is very, very specific.
Exactly. Their vision of American exceptionalism is incredibly distorted and dangerous.
Okay.
It's based on this idea that the United States is a Christian nation, that we have this divine mission to impose our will on the rest of the world, and that's a recipe for disaster.
Right. So essentially what you're saying is they want to force their beliefs on everyone else.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
It leads to arrogance, it leads to recklessness, and it leads to a disregard for the sovereignty of other nations.
And it also undermines America's credibility on the world stage, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the United States has long been a champion of democracy and human rights and the rule of law.
Right.
But if we embrace the agenda of Project 2025, we're going to become a much more isolated and less respected country.
Right, because other countries are going to be looking at us and saying, what are you doing?
Exactly. And so we need to reject this dangerous vision of American exceptionalism.
So we need to reclaim the true meaning of American exceptionalism.
Exactly. We need to reaffirm our commitment to democracy, to human rights, to the rule of law, and we need to work to build a more just and peaceful world for all people, not just for ourselves.
And one of their main tools is propaganda, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, propaganda is a very powerful tool, and the proponents of Project 2025 are very skilled propagandists.
Right.
They use all sorts of sophisticated techniques to shape public opinion, to manipulate emotions, and to control behavior.
So what are some of those techniques? How do they do that?
Well, they often use very emotionally charged language.
Right.
They appeal to people's fears and prejudices, and they're not afraid to use outright lies to advance their agenda.
So they're preying on people's fears.
Exactly. And so, I think it's really important to be aware of these tactics, to be a critical consumer of information, and to learn how to identify propaganda and to challenge it.
So, okay, what about the long game? How do we fight this in the long term?
Well, I think, the first thing to remember is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. This is going to be a long and difficult struggle.
Right.
And we need to be prepared for that. We need to be patient, we need to be persistent, and we need to be strategic.
So we can't give up.
Exactly. We can't afford to give up, and we need to be prepared for setbacks.
Yeah.
There are going to be times when it seems like the forces of authoritarianism are winning.
Right.
But we can't let that discourage us.
So that's when it's even more important to keep fighting.
Exactly. We have to never give up hope. We have to never stop fighting.
Right.
And we have to always believe that a better future is possible, because it is.
Right.
And the future of our democracy depends on it.
This plan seems to be really, really focused on dismantling those checks and balances that are so fundamental to our democracy.
Oh, absolutely. And, that's one of their main goals, right?
Right.
They want to eliminate any obstacle that might prevent them from achieving their agenda. And so they're constantly looking for ways to weaken or eliminate the institutions that are designed to check the power of the executive branch.
So that's how they intend to, consolidate their control.
Exactly. So, for example, they want to limit the power of congressional committees, which would make it much harder for Congress to investigate the executive branch and hold them accountable. They want to pack the courts with judges who share their ideology, which would essentially give them control over the judiciary.
Wow. So you're saying they want to control every branch of government?
As much as possible, yes. And, the goal here is really to create a system where the president and his appointees are essentially unrestrained by the will of the people or by the rule of law.
So it doesn't really matter what the people want.
Exactly. And that's a very, very dangerous erosion of democratic norms. And it's a pathway to tyranny. And so, I think it's really important that we defend the institutions that protect our freedoms,
Yeah.
that we hold our elected officials accountable, and that we demand that they uphold the Constitution.
Absolutely. It's amazing to me that this is something that actually has appeal to people.
Oh, yeah.
What is the appeal of this?
Oh, I think a lot of it has to do with fear and insecurity. A lot of people are feeling very threatened by the changing demographics of the United States. They're feeling like their values and their beliefs are under attack, and they're drawn to the simplicity and the certainty of the message that Project 2025 is offering.
Okay.
It's this very black and white worldview. There are clear heroes and villains.
Right. So it oversimplifies very complex issues.
Exactly. And the solutions are very simple and straightforward. And that's very appealing to people who are feeling anxious and uncertain about the world.
Right. So it gives them a sense of comfort.
Exactly. It gives them a sense of comfort and control in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and unpredictable.
So it's easier to just point fingers than to try to work together to solve these problems.
Exactly. And that's why, I think it's so important to resist the temptation to embrace these kinds of simple solutions and to really engage in the hard work of thoughtful dialogue and debate, and to try to find common ground and to build an inclusive and just society for everyone.
So what would the long-term consequences be for American democracy if this plan were to succeed?
Well, if Project 2025 succeeds, it will have a devastating impact on this country.
Why?
It will undermine our core values, it will erode our freedoms, and it will create a society that is divided, oppressive, and ultimately, I think, unsustainable.
So it's a direct attack on the core principles of America.
Absolutely. And it will also damage America's standing in the world.
Okay. How so?
Well, the United States has long been seen as a beacon of democracy and freedom. But if we embrace Project 2025, that image is going to be tarnished.
Right.
And it's going to make it much harder for us to promote democracy and human rights abroad. And it's going to alienate our allies who share our values.
Right.
So the stakes here are incredibly high. I mean, the future of our nation is at stake. And the future of the world, I think, is at stake as well.
So we need to show the world that this is not what America stands for?
Exactly. We need to show the world that we're better than this. And, that's really what's so insidious about this whole thing, right? They're trying to dismantle the very foundation of our nation and replace it with something that's completely alien to our system of government. They want to create a theocracy.
The theocracy?
Yeah.
So you're saying a government that's actually controlled by religious leaders?
Exactly. And in a theocracy, individual rights and freedoms are completely subordinate to religious dogma.
That's a frightening prospect. I mean, it goes against everything that America stands for.
It does. And what's really ironic is that the proponents of this plan, they actually claim that they're trying to restore America to its Christian roots.
Right.
But that's just a completely false and misleading narrative.
Okay.
I mean, the United States was founded on the principle of separation of church and state.
No.
Our founding fathers understood the dangers of mixing religion and government. And that's why they wrote the First Amendment, which guarantees the free exercise of religion, but also prohibits the establishment of a state religion.
Right. So there's a clear separation there.
Exactly. And Project 2025 would completely violate that fundamental principle.
So it's not really about religious freedom at all.
It's not. It's about power. It's about control. It's about imposing a particular religious worldview on everyone, regardless of their own beliefs.
And that really undermines the very fabric of our society.
It does, because, we're a pluralistic society. We have people of all different faiths and no faith at all. And we need to be able to live together peacefully and respectfully.
So how do we push back against that? I mean, how do we make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, I think the first step is just to be aware of what they're trying to do, to understand the threat.
Right.
And then we need to start speaking out against it, challenging their narrative, defending the separation of church and state, and making sure that everyone understands what's at stake here.
So this isn't just, about what happens in America. It's really something that could have ripple effects around the world.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is about the future of democracy globally. Because if the United States, the country that's supposed to be the leader of the free world, if we succumb to this kind of theocratic authoritarianism, it's going to send a very dangerous message to other countries.
It normalizes that kind of behavior.
Exactly. And it emboldens those forces, the authoritarian forces around the world who are already trying to undermine democracy and human rights.
So what can we do? How do we fight this?
Well, I wish I had all the answers.
Yeah.
But I think, the first thing is just to never give up hope. We have to believe that a better future is possible. We have to believe that we can defeat this.
Right. So this isn't the time to be complacent. This is the time to get involved.
Exactly. And, there are a lot of different ways to get involved.
Okay.
You can support organizations that are fighting for democracy and human rights. You can contact your elected officials and let them know that you oppose this agenda. You can talk to your friends and family about it. You can educate yourself about the issues.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot that we can do. But we have to do something. We can't just sit back and let this happen.
So it sounds like this deep dive has really uncovered some disturbing truths about Project 2025.
Yeah.
It seems like it really aims to erode those democratic principles that we hold so dear and replace our system of, inclusivity and respect for diversity with one very narrow ideology.
Yeah.
And it seems like it wants to completely rewrite what it means to be American.
It does. And that's why it's so important to be aware of this threat.
So this is really a stark warning then.
It is, but it's also a call to action. Because we have the power to stop this. We can't afford to be complacent. We can't afford to be silent. We have to fight back.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about all those individuals and those organizations that are already out there fighting to protect our freedoms.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to research, what they're doing and see how we can all support them, whether that's through volunteering or donating or just spreading the word.
Right.
Because our actions, no matter how small they may seem, they can make a difference.
They can. And the future of our democracy really does depend on it.
And it all starts with us.
It does. We, the people, have to be the ones to defend our democracy.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for our deep dive today. I hope this exploration has left you feeling informed and hopefully empowered and ready to engage in those crucial conversations that are so important.
I hope so, too.
This plan really does seek to control the narrative, but we need to make sure that we control our future.